I remember the exact pattern of the acoustic tiles on the ceiling of a waiting room just off Shea Boulevard here in Scottsdale. I was 54 years old, staring up at those little gray dots, doing the math in my head while an air conditioning vent rattled in the corner. Between the high deductibles, the out-of-network consults, the comprehensive lab panels, and the specialized imaging tests, I had recently crossed the $5,000 mark. $5,000. That was the price tag to sit on a crinkly paper sheet and have a man in a white coat who looked 10 years younger than me tell me that waking up 4 times a night and feeling like my internal plumbing was slowly failing was just a normal part of getting older. I walked out of that clinic into the blinding Arizona heat feeling significantly worse than when I went in. It was not because I had received a terrible diagnosis. It was because I had received no diagnosis at all. I had a lighter wallet, a patronizing pat on the shoulder, and a vague instruction to watch my caffeine intake. That was it. That was the modern medical establishment's grand solution for a problem that was quietly dismantling my life, ruining my sleep, and stripping away my confidence piece by piece. If you are watching this right now, there's a very high probability you know exactly what that specific flavor of frustration tastes like. You know the quiet, heavy feeling of realizing your body is changing, going to the supposed experts for a clear path forward, and walking away completely empty-handed. I know a lot of men who are sitting exactly where you are today, quietly assuming their hardware is permanently broken and that they just have to live with a shrinking existence. I am going to tell you what I ended up figuring out entirely on my own. It is the exact framework I wish someone had just laid out for me before I spent a small fortune looking for a complex medical answer to a fundamentally mechanical problem. The issue I was dealing with was not that I was dying. The issue was that my daily existence had devolved into a strategic military operation. I was constantly mapping out restrooms before I even agreed to enter a restaurant. I stopped drinking water at 3 in the afternoon, which just left me chronically dehydrated, irritable, and exhausted. And the nights were the absolute worst. Waking up at 2 in the morning, then 4, then 5. Dragging myself out of bed in the dark, trying not to wake Alyssa, staring at my reflection in the harsh bathroom mirror, and wondering where my vitality had disappeared to. I spent decades running regional sales teams across the country. I learned early on to look at complex businesses the same way you look at large engines. If a pressure relief valve is constantly going off and screaming, you do not just put a larger bucket under the valve and call it a day. You have to figure out why the pressure is building up in the wrong places to begin with. The specialists I paid thousands of dollars to were looking at my prostate as a completely isolated component. They were only looking at the valve. But what I finally understood, through months of relentless reading and digging into the actual mechanics of the aging male body, was that the valve was just responding to a massive system-wide failure in communication. When we crossed that 50-year mark, our bodies completely stopped forgiving our daily negligence. The plumbing infrastructure in our lower half is heavily dependent on 2 critical factors to function: unrestricted peripheral blood flow and a balance of signals that keeps the surrounding tissues from inflaming. For over 30 years, I sat in cramped airplane seats, rented sedans, and leather boardroom chairs. I was physically compressing the very infrastructure that keeps a man functioning correctly. I was starving the local tissue of oxygen and allowing cellular inflammation to build up like thick rust in a vital fuel line. And the expensive medical advice I received completely ignored the state of the engine and just looked at the tailpipe. I had a friend, an older guy in my industry, who went through the exact same cycle. He ended up getting a surgical procedure he likely did not need, simply because no one told him his daily habits were creating the pressure. The first concrete thing I had to change was how I managed the pressure in the system. Like most men dealing with this, I thought I was doing the smart thing by cutting off my fluid intake early in the evening. I assumed less water meant less pressure, but severe dehydration actually makes the urine highly concentrated and acidic. That acidity directly irritates the sensitive lining of the bladder, which triggers the exact same urgency response I was desperately trying to avoid. It is exactly like trying to run thick, dirty oil through a tight mechanical filter. The internal sensor panics and throws an error code. I had to completely relearn my intake. I started front-loading my hydration. I began drinking the vast majority of my water before noon, flushing the system completely when my body was upright, active, and moving. and then tapering off naturally as the sun went down. That single shift changed the chemical signal my bladder was sending to my brain. The sudden, violent urgency started to stretch out. I stopped feeling like I was always living on the edge of an embarrassing emergency. The second change was purely mechanical, and it required undoing decades of damage. I had spent 30 years essentially sitting on my own pelvic floor, compressing the dense network of nerves and blood vessels that control every single function below the belt. When you park a car in a garage for 10 years, the rubber hoses dry, rot, and crack. When you sit at a desk for 30 years, the internal tissue loses all its natural elasticity. The pathways choke. I started doing targeted deep squat mobility work every single morning. Not heavy weights in a crowded gym. Just opening up the chassis on my own living room rug. Getting the blood to finally flush into areas that had been physically compressed and starved for decades. It felt ridiculous at first, dropping into a deep stretch before the coffee was even brewed. But within a few weeks, the constant, dull, heavy pressure I had been living with in my lower abdomen started to lift. The internal plumbing needs physical space to operate efficiently, and I was finally giving that space back. The third shift was the hardest for me to implement because it required admitting I was actively poisoning my own well. For years, I liked a heavy pour of bourbon and a large, dense meal late in the evening to unwind from the sheer stress of my day. I convinced myself I had earned it. But alcohol and late-night sugar act as massive inflammatory triggers, particularly in the lower pelvic region. They create a localized swelling response exactly where you have the absolute least room for error. It is like turning up the heat on a radiator that is already boiling over and threatening to crack. I made the decision to cut the late alcohol entirely and move my last meal to a strict 3 hours before I went to sleep. The difference was not subtle. The midnight wake-up calls cut in half almost immediately, just from removing that chemical stressor. And that meant I was finally stringing together enough consecutive hours of deep sleep to let my body actually repair itself. If you have ever felt that exact same hollow frustration sitting in a doctor's office, or if any of this mechanical approach to the male body makes sense to you, hit the like button right now. It helps get this specific conversation in front of other men who are currently sitting in waiting rooms wasting their money on non-answers. We have to share the things that actually move the needle for us. Getting the mechanics right and fixing the daily inputs completely changed the game for me. But I am a realist. I had accumulated decades of wear and tear, and the biological reality is that after 50, the internal hormonal shifts create an environment that makes it incredibly hard to maintain that balance on discipline alone. I realized I needed to support the physical infrastructure from the inside out. I absolutely did not want a prescription contract with a list of side effects longer than my arm. I started researching on my own and found a natural support protocol that actually made logical mechanical sense. The one I use daily relies heavily on saw palmetto, which works by physically blocking the internal conversion of your testosterone into DHT. DHT is the aggressive byproduct that essentially tells that specific gland to keep growing and causing pressure against the plumbing. The compound preserves what your body produces instead of letting it turn into the exact thing causing the blockage. The protocol also includes epimedium, which supports the physical blood flow to the region without the harsh synthetic spikes and crashes you get from pharmacy pills. It is simply about keeping the pathways open and the signals clear. I never tell another man what he should take, but if you want to look at the exact formulation I incorporated into my morning routine, I put a link in the pinned comment right below this video. You can also just scan the QR code you see on the screen right now. I researched a lot of garbage before I found something with a clean mechanism that I actually trust to put in my body. Because here is the bigger picture that the specialists never talk about. This is never just about how many times you wake up in the dark to use the bathroom. It is about the massive cascade effect it has on the rest of your life. When you do not sleep deeply, your baseline testosterone bottoms out. When your testosterone bottoms out, your daily mood crashes, your patience evaporates, and your waistline expands regardless of what you eat. You start withdrawing from the people you care about. I know I did. I pulled away from Alyssa during that time, not because I did not love her, but because I was chronically exhausted and felt entirely disconnected from my own physical body. We pretend these physical annoyances are just isolated, embarrassing issues we have to hide. They aren't. They dictate the kind of man we are capable of being for the people who rely on us. When I fixed the plumbing, I got my unbroken sleep back. When I got my sleep back, I got my clear mind back. We accept a terrifying amount of physical degradation as normal simply because it is common among men our age. Do not let an expensive medical bill convince you that you just have to live a smaller, more restricted, more anxious life. You have agency over this machine. You just have to stop treating the warning light on the dashboard and start actively servicing the engine block. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever tried to fix this issue and couldn't figure out why your approach wasn't working? I read them all, and I know exactly how isolating that cycle of failure can be. Do not wait another 5 years hoping the physical problem will magically reverse itself while you sleep. The longer you let deep inflammation and poor physical mechanics dictate your day, the harder it is to rebuild the infrastructure when you finally decide to act. Start making the physical changes to your routine tomorrow morning. And if you want to give your body the internal structural support it needs to process those changes efficiently, check out the protocol I use. The link is right there in the pinned comment down below, and the QR code is still on your screen. Take a serious look at the ingredients. See if the biological mechanism makes sense for where you are standing right now. I am Cole Harrison. Keep doing the work.